Hello, we have Bob Dignen again today with us on our third session of the interview series on global projects and virtual teams. Bob, thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you very much. I hope you're well.
Thank you, Bob, and likewise. So today we have the topic of how individuals can manage culture in a pragmatic way. So it's an extension of what we talked about in the second session, and the reason being that it is a complex topic, the human factors, the culture. So we thought we'll dedicate at least two sessions talking about cultural factors and human factors in dealing with or managing global and virtual teams. So, so Bob, what do you think are other important factors to consider when looking at how individuals can manage culture in a pragmatic ways?
Okay, as we said before, the term culture is a complex one, really not easy to define. That's firstly, it's complex as a term. Secondly, I would say right at the outset that I still have the sensation that there is an overestimation and overfocus on national culture as a determining influence in the project environment. You know, we're constantly saying it's happening because he or she is from India or China, etc. But having said that, I mean, culture, let's view it as a metaphor, or let's view it as a device which enables us to focus on diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of diversity which you need to manage when you're leading a project or just participating as a team member in the project. The cultural discourses that are out there from the gurus do throw up some interesting dimensions. For example, around risk, attitudes to risk, the idea that in some contexts or some individuals are more risk averse or are more risk tolerant. Those kind of dimensions can be quite significant in the attitudes that people bring to bear on planning. But those kinds of terms like risk avoidance or power distance is another big one from Hofstadter. And those terms they're useful, but I like to bring it down to, I would recommend that those leading or working in projects focus on 6 dimensions of diversity, which I think we can predict are going to cause problems for the project. Firstly, different attitudes to leadership. You're going to experience different attitudes there when you work in global projects. Different attitudes to teams. Different attitudes to structuring or kind of planning, decision making. Fourthly, different attitudes to communication. Mm-hmm. Different attitudes to relationships. That's number 5. And finally, different attitudes to time. So we don't need to use complex terminology, but those 6 dimensions I can more or less guarantee, irrespective of whether it's a cultural influence or a psychological difference, you're going to have people around you who have quite different attitudes to those 6 dimensions. But I don't know, what do you think? Does that, we can go into details in a minute, but do those areas sound logical?
They do, Bob, and I liked how you mentioned that we overemphasize on national culture and we don't look at individuals per se more in detail, because you could be in India and you could have someone who's individually an individual person who might be highly risk averse, or another individual who might be very willing to take more risks. So there is a personality element to it. And going to the 6 dimensions you mentioned, I really liked how you avoided using very complex terms to describe these 6 dimensions. And so they cover the leadership, attitude to leadership, attitude towards team, how planning occurs. So that was the third one. You mentioned time, how people perceive time. So that's the fourth one. I think I'm trying to recall the other 3. So,
Communication. And relationships.
Now, if it's okay, we could potentially go into detail of each of these to kind of get a better idea of what they actually mean in terms of how we manage in a pragmatic, practical way. But I think they capture pretty much all the dimensions. I'm actually trying to see if we could add anything to that, but I think those 6 dimensions cover pretty much the full range and full dimension of the human and the cultural elements that we're covering. So
if we start with leadership, perhaps there are a couple. I mean, there are a number of ways you can break down these 6 areas, and I would encourage people to reflect on the dimensions of these dimensions that are significant. But let's a couple of very simple ones. Leadership. You get some leaders who are from a very specialist technical background. They're subject matter experts. You get some leaders in a project context who are more generalist, and that they're relying on the team of experts to provide the technical knowledge. That is those simple dynamics can produce a lot of very difficult challenges for teams. The specialist tends to know more than the team member. They tend to micromanage a little bit too much. With good intentions, it causes really negative feelings that the leader doesn't trust the team member and is micromanaging. On the other hand, if a team of specialists is led by a generalist leader with all the right connections in the company to drive the senior stakeholders to project success, but lacks technical knowledge, they also lack credibility. And that cause a disengagement between the team and the leader, simply due to different basic attitudes to and beliefs about leadership. But have you seen those kinds of differences at play in projects?
Absolutely. I think I've seen both dynamics, and I've seen those leaders who are very much technically adept. They know what they know the domain, and so because they know the domain, it's just this natural tendency to really want to know what everyone's doing and how they're doing it, so that they can have a say in it. And sometimes it's difficult for them to resist that. And then the opposite is also true, where the leader actually doesn't have much knowledge about the project, and so they lose a lot of respect. Like the team members just say, "Why is he even managing us? Because he doesn't even know what we're really doing." So there's a lack of respect. So a lot of ways that affects the communication and sometimes even the motivation of team members. It looks like you can't really win with this unless there's a level of awareness within the team and with the leader of how to manage this kind of extremes, I guess.
And even though one is aware of these differences, because they connect down often to quite deep values. I mean, the generalist leader often believes in empowerment, in delegation, in self-directed teams, and that goes down to equality and democracy, which are core values. On the other hand, you've got the professional who believes in commitment, hard work, expertise, quality delivered by attention to detail. That's professionalism. That goes down to hardcore values. And the problem is, it's easy to describe, but to migrate and accept other people's values is another ball game, totally.
Absolutely. And so, Bob, would you what are your recommendations in managing this complexity between the two types of leadership models that we mentioned and the attitudes towards this? How would one?
I think the first thing is to explore, to discuss where people are coming from, and this partly relates to, when one thinks about culture, we think about culture out there influencing us, creating us, and therefore we should probably share that level of creation with those around us, so that we're at least aware of others and we can appreciate where others are coming from. So that's one approach to culture, to share what has created you, to share where you're coming from. But I guess the other issue around culture is that, wherever you come from in a project, it is ultimately the job of the project leader and the team collaboratively to create their own culture, irrespective of the original cultures which drove them to that place. So I think my recommendation would be around co-creation. So discuss where you've come from, discuss your expectations, discuss the task at hand, because ultimately it's the task on the resources available that should determine the style of leadership, not belief. And then through that discussion, as a collective, ultimately you come to that collective decision about how to drive forward and how to execute in your environment. So sharing, being open with your preferences, but then ultimately making a smart decision based upon the situation.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point, the concept of co-creation and creating a new culture, the team culture. Now, in that process of co-creation, would it be worth, now this is basically noting down the details of some of the processes, would it be worth for the leader to actually, let's say if we've got a leader who is a generalist and is not an expert in the area, would it be worth for them to exercise a certain level of humility and basically say, look, guys, I don't have the background, but I trust you that you do, and I'm here to support you, and I'm here to provide you with all the resources, and kind of being humble in a way in order to gain that respect that he would otherwise not receive if he was the expert. Would that kind of have a positive influence on the team?
I think it's a very good question, but of course it's impossible to answer because the answer will always be it depends on the context. In some contexts, showing humility, showing transparency with the limits of one's knowledge could engage, could inspire followership because it's honest and open. It has a certain level of integrity and actually shows a certain level of respect to the specialists in the team. So it could very well succeed. On the other hand, by exposing inexperience and the lack of competence in front of somebody who simply isn't willing to hear that and engage with that, it could destroy the team from the moment it begins. So this is always the issue with leadership behavior. A lot of people are looking for universal guidelines around leadership, and that itself is a very dangerous attitude. Ultimately, it's know yourself, know the environment, take a smart decision that works.
So then I guess it might be to really understand, for a leader to really understand the team members, where they're coming from. So probably the first interaction or approach would be for the leader to ask more questions from the team members to get an understanding of their mindset and their attitudes, so that he could adapt his leadership style, as you mentioned, to the team. I think that's very, very wise in the sense. I think a lot of leaders don't do the data collection. They don't do the one-to-one meetings when they begin the team or they enter a new territory. And as a result, through a lack of knowledge, they either make a bad decision based upon poor evidence or simply decide to make an assumption which can easily fall in the wrong way. So I think one-to-ones is a generally, maybe we can call that a best practice. Those leaders that I see succeeding tend to invest a lot of time in that, and it is time-consuming up front, but it seems to pay off with faster execution later. Absolutely. So just to summarize the first dimension, it would be wise for the leader, regardless of whether they're the expert or the generalist, to gather data, to inquire, and to get a better understanding of the team. So that's probably one of the most important aspects of the leadership element, is to really understand the team and what motivates the team. Because regardless of whether you're a generalist or an expert, understanding what would bring the best out of the team is probably one common element in both of these leadership styles. Is that correct, Bob? Would you agree with that?
Exactly. Remember, when you're having that one-to-one and you're asking questions, you're looking at the psychology of the individual. You're looking at the competence of the individual, because those are two different things. You're also looking, if you're dealing with transversal projects, at the environment in which that individual performs their work. You know, if they're in an IT department which is highly resourced and highly expert with the latest technology, you've got one kind of individual. If you're dealing with an IT department that is dealing with old legacy systems where there are varying levels of competence, high levels of turnover in the department, then you've got a very different individual in front of you. So you've got to get to know the individual, but getting to know the individual means more than their psychology. It means particularly what they're good at, what motivates them, and also their own working context. Because, of course, if you've got somebody from sales or marketing or production, they've got a different set of KPIs driving their behavior, and they may need to be led in a different way.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you for that, Bob. So second point is the team. So how do we navigate the attitude and the culture towards a team?
Probably the easiest way to point out one of the most disturbing differences I see in attitudes to team is to think about PMI and the kind of work breakdown structure and the concept of defined role in projects, which is embedded in PMI philosophy, against the concept of team role, which is embedded in Agile or Scrum, this kind of very flexible, fluid, collaborative role. And I see a lot of disconnects in project teams where people arrive in the same team. One individual has the idea that a project is efficient if individuals have clearly defined and fixed roles, working almost autonomously, but delivering data into a central pool. Whereas other people arrive and they think, no, that's not a team, that's not collaborative. What you need to do is have shared responsibilities, work together, everybody shows leadership for driving the results. It's more kind of fuzzy success. And of course, with fuzzy, the structured guys see chaos. And with structure, the fuzzy guys see rigidity and hierarchy. And I've spent the last 10 years listening to that kind of vocabulary. And it's not until you actually map it down and show the values behind those two styles that people can then begin to engage. So, yeah, people overuse the word team without defining the word team. They overuse the word role without defining or understanding there are very different attitudes there. And simple conversations around that. Drawing your team, that'll be that's one very powerful activity. Get people to visualize what their team looks like. What is its shape? What are the distances between the parts? What are the flows of information between the parts? Through that process of visualization, you get to much greater clarity than discussion, actually.
Absolutely. And so would it be worth for teams to try to reconcile the two models, because there are advantages and disadvantages of each? So having clear roles, as in the case of the PMI model, obviously there's clarity about tasks and roles and everything, but then there's rigidity at the same time.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other extreme, the agile model, there's fluidity, but there is also a real sense of collaboration, because you see you are responsible not just for your part but also for the parts of others. So there's more I guess interaction, and there's more collaboration and in driving the project. So would it be worth to kind of especially when you have team members which have more experience with either the agile or the hierarchical, the PMI model, but they're coming together and they have these different mindsets, would it be worth for them to say, hey, look, here are the two models. I think we need to reconcile the two so that there is some structure, but there's also responsibility for others and the whole project. And would that be a kind of a good kind of conversation to have between team members?
Yeah, I think the discussion is useful, and I hear those conversations taking place sometimes, and I hear very often the common solution is to use Agile in the early phases of a project, during the initiation phases, when you're bouncing ideas around. You don't want to fix things too quickly. You want fluidity and creativity. Once things are clear and you really need a sense people to go away and just get on with the job and to report in on their deliverables, then you move back to the more kind of PMI-based approach, because that's the demand of the situation. If things change and you need to reconfigure the project, rescope it in some way, maybe you go back to an agile approach for a couple of weeks and just allow a bit more creativity to inject. And again, it comes back to what we were discussing before. It's applying sensible models of interaction according to the demand of the situation, rather than applying things ideologically. Because ideological at some point disconnects from reality.
Absolutely, and that adaptability is the key factor here, to adapt to the situation and apply the required methodologies in the right time and the right place.
I mean, the challenging thing for large corporates is that large corporates tend to operate with standards. They tend to operate with a single approach in all countries, in all contexts. So the common sense that we've just spoken through, although individuals kind of would probably agree with that, they're limited by their environmental constraint, namely their organization, which insists very often that you use a PMI model at all times, irrespective of the needs. And that kind of unfortunately places very capable people into problematic situations. They don't want to do what they have to do, but the reporting demands of their company require that they complete all the templates throughout the course of the project and abandon creativity. So it's not as straightforward as just having conversations. You've got environmental limits, actually.
Absolutely. And hopefully we have senior leaders from organizations listening to this interview and kind of getting a better understanding of what's important.
I mean, to be fair, it's not an easy challenge to resolve. I mean, there is a logic. If you've got a large organization cross-border, you need to have boxes. You need to have data reported in predictable bite sizes at predictable periods if you really want to report at regular quarterly intervals to shareholders. So there is a kind of a systemic logic to it. Unfortunately, with a highly volatile environment, that systemic logic to shareholders often doesn't meet the environment. And that's nobody's fault, but it's important to be aware that you have that systemic complexity so that when the conflicts arise, you approach the conflict in a positive manner.
Absolutely, and I think the last point was spot on, Bob, in terms of having a systemic view and a holistic perspective on what we're trying, and everyone having that kind of perspective, rather than saying, "Hey, I'm attached to my job description, my job role," and not really seeing the holistic, the systemic view of what they're trying to achieve.
Exactly.
Thank you, Bob. So now moving on to the third dimension. Was that communication, Bob?
Yeah, we can pick up communication because different attitudes to communication, again, are a regular source of challenge within a project context. I mean, there are a number of ways you can cut and look at communication. I think probably one of the most obvious ones to be aware of is direct versus indirect. I mean, interculturalists will talk about low context, kind of very direct, fact-based, empirical-based communication. You just say it how it is, which is attached to notions of structure and honesty and speed, and contrasting that with more indirect communication, where the user is always aware of the feelings of the counterparts and always balancing truth with the desire for harmony. And those are such polar opposite positions to live one's life by. But being direct for the indirect person is simply impolite, rude very often. Paradoxically, being indirect and fuzzy to the direct person is seen as impolite and rude. So these are emotional reactions triggered by the very core behaviors with which human beings interact. And that's, despite the awareness raising, it remains very challenging to deal with these two opposites.
Now, just to touch on those two types of communication, indirect and direct, there is a cultural element to a national cultural element to it, but it's also personality, isn't it, Bob? So some individuals just prefer to be honest and frank, and some prefer to really tap into the emotions and not hurt the other person's feelings. So there is an element of culture, but there's also an element of personality. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's also linked to elements of psychology around dominance and assertiveness against kind of modesty and compliance. People just position themselves differently in relation to each other through communication and through culture. So it's often you're not able to say where the difference comes from, but that difference is one that's very important to be aware of, and probably for teams to actually think about maybe what kinds of language are acceptable. What kind of language do we want to hear in this team? and maybe to draw some boundaries, maybe some kind of language that isn't acceptable. I've sat in project meetings where people have used, I would say, a non-compliant behaviour at a certain level, kind of shouting and not beating somebody physically, but beating somebody verbally. And very interestingly, I was at an event yesterday. A speaker from Siemens was talking around recent brain science, which looks at the similarity in the brain between physical pain and the emotional pain you feel when you're shouted at. Mm-hmm. And actually, from a neurological point of view, those are identical. Mm. And then that raises a very, very interesting question. Of course, you would never hit somebody physically, but somehow people seem to feel it's more acceptable to cause emotional discontent, even if that pain is almost identical to physical pain. And maybe we should really think, do we want to cause pain to our counterpart in the way we communicate?
Absolutely, that's a really good point. I mean, so what you're saying is the neuroscientists said that in the brain, the same centers, the same areas of the brain probably trigger when you have physical pain and emotional pain. They are identical kind of responses.
Exactly. So if I'm sitting talking to you and I see you're not listening to me, and that causes me discomfort and uncertainty and a degree of stress, that's equivalent to you punching me. Mm. Now, that may seem a very bizarre and a strong way to say it, but if we view it in that way, that it is of an equal weight, then that puts an obligation on you to act with much more caution and care and respect, which in the end is actually what we want and is actually professional.
Absolutely. Okay, and thankfully that I'm listening intensively to your speech, so I should you're not feeling it. Now, Bob, just going back to your earlier point on the communication side of things. Now, would it be valuable for teams to, again, because in a team you might have those who prefer the indirect and those who prefer the direct, but would it be valuable to have a conversation initially to say, okay, what about our values, core values for this team? And it basically also goes back to the first 2 points that a team culture needs to be created, and everyone needs to agree on some form of communication. Their preferences need to be taken into account. But at the end of the day, should there be a kind of a particular strategy used ubiquitously within the team in terms of communication, or whether it should be direct or indirect, and that goes back to the values that are created and the culture that's created within the team?
I mean, it's an interesting question, because what you're talking about partly is kind of almost rule making, sort of for teams to norm. And of course, the setting and rules and following of rules is another of these psychological cultural phenomenon, which some people buy into because they like to set rules and follow rules, and other people have sat and they said, "No, do you really want us to set rules for communication? That feels a bit ridiculous." Yeah. So that's the challenging piece there. I mean, the other thing around communication, I think it's useful to discuss, as always. Open discussion tends to bring greater knowledge. Just to throw in, it's not just about direct, indirect. It's also not how we communicate. It's in terms of interaction between the two people. It's also the channel that's very important. Do we communicate by mail? Do we communicate face to face? Telephone conference, video conference, and the timeliness and frequency. That's equally problematic. Some people. Well, for example, I was sitting at a dinner the other day, and I said to the guy next to me, if I send you an email, when will I get a reply? And he said 24 hours. Turned to the next guy and said, when will I get a reply? He said, in 7 days. So both equally professional and competent, but they make a different call about how they manage information and communication. So if you don't have that clear, you've got a real recipe for disaster.
Absolutely, and I'm just thinking, and you're absolutely right about whatever strategy we use, it keeps some people happy, but some people not. So, would it be worth to kind of really focus on empathy and care for the team members? Because from care and empathy, naturally you would have a sense of understanding what works best, and there is also a level of respect that everyone's different, everyone has a different way of doing things, everyone has a different attitude, and so it minimizes the conflict because there is a sense of care and empathy within the team, so that we don't have to have a kind of a rules, regulation, strategies, and all those kind of things that we talked about. But there's a genuine sense of care that underlies all interaction within the team and within the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have the two. I think and you always have the two dimensions. You have the humanistic perspective of caring and supporting and enabling, but a lot of project leaders, particularly, are dealing with remote teams. They're dealing with very, very challenging deadlines, and they also face the dilemma of pushing performance from people who are also very busy locally, and the international project leader has to compete with that local priority. And sometimes it's about applying pressure in the right way without overstepping ethical boundaries. So, yes, care and respect for the individual, but at another level, you've got care and respect for the organization that is paying your salary. And so you've got split loyalties there. And that's a real dilemma that many leading projects suffer, and there really is no easy answer for that at all.
And absolutely, I 100% agree with that. But one of the things that that I've been quite interested in is looking at how, now looking at the context that you just spoke about, that there is a local commitment. If the international project manager shows a high level of care, so going back to the care factor, would it be likely that the team members, the virtual team members and those who are remote, would feel that there's a sense of feel a sense of high commitment towards the international project manager because they feel like they get more cared for? So there's that element of, yeah, we're getting paid and we're getting a salary, we'll do our job, but we also want to commit to this project manager who actually cares for us. So there's no. So
I think that's always true. To build a sense of followership as the international project leader, but at the end of the day, the team member goes back to the local environment. They have a local boss. That local boss will sanction the salary increase and the career opportunity for that individual. So, however hard the project leader works with an individual, that individual knows in 2 years the project's over. I may never see that guy again. And that's part of the problem of projects. People know that it's time bound, and however hard you try to build relationships, at the back of their mind, you know that in 2 years it's going to be over. And so it's very challenging to get high levels of loyalty and performance, however much care you show. It's a dilemma. It's lots of things you should certainly try and work with, but at the end of the day, I see many project leaders fall back on quite transactional mechanisms because that's the only thing that will work for them. And that's not to say that's wrong. It's just a situational adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Bob. So now moving on to the fourth dimension.
We can talk about relationships. And we've touched on this a little bit, and it relates to direct and indirect. Working in Germany a lot, I don't like cultural generalizations, but because I work in Germany a lot, there is certainly a feeling both internally within the environment here and people looking at it that we're dealing with a very, very task-oriented environment where interpersonal relationships are deeply secondary within projects to getting the job done. Competence is respected more than empathy, performance is respected more than friendliness. And in a sense, it's unprofessional and almost impolite to try and get too personal. Mm-hmm. And then you've got in the same project team people who are at a polar opposite position, that a relationship must come before the task is executed. And being openly friendly, lots of questions, lots of personal sharing and out-of-work activity is simply a requirement. It's a basic human thing to do if you're going to work together. And again, I see big disconnects between people who are anchored in one of those positions and struggle to move across it.
Okay, now going back to that point, Bob. So is that in the German context that you have people who have those extreme mentalities, or this is outside Germany?
Well, I mean, Germany, of course, again, most intercultural analysis will indicate Germany as a task-oriented environment, where in the workplace relationships are relegated. Of course, depends on the company, depends on the individual, but this would be the cultural analysis. And having worked in Germany a lot, I mean, I experience that cultural phenomenon through specific individuals that I meet, and even as a Brit. I meet it on a daily basis. I'll walk into an office and I'll say, "How are you?" And I'll get the answer, "Fine." Punct. Silent. Nothing more. The question is answered. What more do you want? And of course, I'm not interested in the answer. What I want is somebody to talk to me and ask me how I am. And it's even though I know all of that and I know what I'm dealing with, it still feels emotionally disturbing. And that's the interesting thing about the difference between cognitive and affective. It's easy to intellectually know all of this stuff, but the emotions are still there year after year, despite all the cognitive training.
Absolutely. So it's just the awareness and the knowledge of it is just not enough because you still have that human need for connection.
No, I still don't like it. I want to be. I still feel the little trickles of anger when I'm not asked, because that's me, my very identity, being challenged and. But I guess I have the control because I don't shout at people now.
That's a really good point. I mean, it is true that we might have an awareness and knowledge of those cultural differences, but yet we still haven't emotionally reconciled it with ourselves. That we still have those basic needs. It is part of us. That definitely causes a real challenge when dealing, I guess, across or engaging with those who from different cultures.
Yeah, I think it's very important because when we talk about the concept of flexibility, because we can intellectualize this and say, oh yes, I understand task-oriented or relationship-oriented culture, because we have that cognitive flexibility, we often think we're behaviorally and emotionally as flexible. But the fact that we can think flexibly across two different styles has no connection to our ability to manage our behavior flexibly or to manage our emotions flexibly. Those are much longer term and deeper competencies. So very often people overestimate their flexibility and underestimate their rigidity and underestimate the negative impacts they're having on others by the behaviors that they think they're not using.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And so is there a strategy to navigate that? What would be the best suggestion? Would it still be about just self-reflecting and, when that does happen, when you do get a response which is based on either the personality or the culture of the individual and it's not in line with what you expect, would it be worth to just reflect and say, hey, just take a moment to just think about that and be aware of that, obviously, emotional response, but then also just intellectualizing it and just stepping back from it? Would that be the strategy to adapt, Bob, or would there be any?
Yeah, I think there are three core strategies. One of which you're describing is kind of reflection, kind of keeping a reflective journal as you go through a project, so you can reflect on your thinking processes and look at them with a little bit of distance and the same kind of intellectual creativity you can when you're reading a book, and that's a useful process to look at the way in which your thinking processes change. Of course, feedback is another useful mechanism. Saying to somebody, you did this, you did that, this is how I felt. And then the other person will say, oh, I didn't realize that, I didn't mean that. This is what I was intending. And through feedback, you get mutual understanding. The third one, there's a lady who works at Copenhagen Business School called Esther Barinaga. She wrote her PhD on international project teams. It's called Leveling Vagueness, a strange title. But she followed a project team and she looked at the way people coped with these kinds of differences. And one of the very interesting strategies she picked up is that people joke about their national stereotype as a way of explaining their behavior, particularly the Germans in the project team. They would say, sorry for being so direct, but I'm German. But can we get down to business? And that kind of compensation mechanism proved very, very successful. It's kind of depersonalizing it. It's using humor but it's making the point. And maybe that's something that we all need to play around with. That's where stereotypes actually could become useful. They become a way to deflate the emotional intensity that we attach to these bumps between ourselves.
Oh, fantastic! No, I think these three strategies I think are really, really good. So the first one would be self-reflection, metacognitive, kind of looking at self-leadership and self-regulation element. The second one would be feedback, just actually having a communication conversation with the other individual, saying, "Look, when you did that, this is how I actually felt," so that that person is also aware of what's happening. And the third one would be actually using humor and cultural stereotypes to diffuse and the emotional or kind of I guess change the expectations of the individuals around the environment to kind of see that it's depersonalized, it's about culture, so it's don't take it personally.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite a complex humor because you're not believing in the stereotype, but you're using the stereotype. But I've seen it work in many different contexts. So if you're capable of using humor and comfortable with people laughing at you because of your nationality, then be brave and try that.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've covered leadership, we've covered team, relationships, communication. What's the next dimension, Bob?
Well, there are two others left. One is an obvious one. It's time. Different attitudes to time. The interculturalists have this terminology of monochronic and polychronic. The monochronics believe in time. They believe that efficiency is delivered by managing time with schedules, with deadlines. The polychronics, more relationship oriented, more environmentally sensitive, just more flexible with time. I mean, you get the same with individuals. It's a great source of tension between individuals and within teams. So I think attitudes to timeliness, again, very useful to explore that in the team. Then the final one is around structuring. Maybe decision making is where I will settle as a kind of final point. We often think that the word decision is a shared one, but in fact there are very different attitudes to decision making. Mm-hmm. For example, firstly we have to what does decision mean? And I remember a meeting with a project leader in Germany where I was actually in the project, and we made a decision, and I left the room. On the train home and on the flight home, I was thinking creatively, as I like to do, and I called the guy the next day and said that, Peter, we've discussed a lot, but I have a few more ideas. And he said, no, we took a decision yesterday. And I said, I know we took a decision, but I've got a few more ideas. And he said, no, we took a decision. And suddenly I realized that we were operating with a totally different attitude and belief system around decision making. For him, it was slow, in-depth, analytical, every risk explored. When that decision came, it was final and binding. For me, that's just not a decision. For me, a decision is something you do quickly, but you're entrepreneurial enough, creative enough, always to revisit that. And revisiting a decision is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of success. It's a sign of creative entrepreneurialism. Whereas for Peter, I think changing the decision, everybody would have to be consulted because they need to be respected, and it would have caused unnecessary delays. It was a failure to change the decision. And I think it's very important that the word decision is explored by project teams, because projects live and breathe by decision making.
Absolutely, that's a really good point, because it looks like that, for instance, you take a more agile approach to decision making, whereas your colleague would take a more of a very structured, very thorough, but then once it's made, then it's very hard to go back and change things, which is kind of has that level of rigidity, but also thoroughness. So so how does one navigate this kind of complexity in decision making?
Again, it comes down. I always remember a guy at the end of one training when we've been discussing, like we're discussing now. We've been discussing it for 2 days, not just under an hour. But he said at the end of the day, after the 2 days, he said to me, everything that you said to me, Bob, I think I can distill it down to make culture discussable. I always remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the major issue, that people don't discuss diversity in a constructive way. In fact, they don't generally discuss it at all. They enter their teams, they enter their collaborative environments with lots of assumptions and lots of pressure, and they just do it the way they like to do it. And when others don't do it the way they like to do it, they get frustrated. I think it's that simple.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think when we look at these 6 dimensions, Bob, as you mentioned, we could potentially exercise, just maybe 3 to 4 basic, processes. One would be what we talked about self-reflection, metacognition, self-regulation, kind of managing your own emotions. But then the second one would have been, communication, feedback, just explaining how you feel, what the culture is, your culture is, what their culture is. Kind of have that conversation, have some humor about it. So these can be pretty much applied across all the challenges, the 6 challenges that we talked about today. Would that be a kind of right to say that we could use?
Yes, it's a good wrap up. Yeah, I think you've actually got four strategies. You've got self-reflection,
mm-hmm.
bearing in mind that if you're irritated, frustrated, angry, you're probably at the point of tolerance, and somebody's pushing your values. So it's a learning moment.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to view. Explanation, open and explicit discussion
mm-hmm.
about differences over a cup of coffee, in a meeting room. Feedback, when something goes wrong, start to discuss it, what happened. And then this kind of use of humour, this
mm-hmm.
exploitation
mm-hmm.
of stereotypes for comic and bonding effects. Maybe those are 4 useful strategies you can apply across all 6 dimensions.
Fantastic. No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Bob. I think that was a very good summary of many of the challenges that international project managers and international teams, virtual teams, could quite possibly and would definitely face in some way or another. And we kind of summarized the strategies to kind of work around it and be able to navigate through those challenges. So I'd like to thank you again. Any final words, Bob, regarding this module, this session?
No, again, just to repeat a little bit. Remember those questions you asked me. What's the right way, the best way? I mean, my overriding reflections in being involved in people development is that there is no right way. You've got to discover the right way for the people around you and the circumstance. That's more painful. It takes more time. You can't just learn the lesson and apply it. So, but that's the reality of life. It's complicated and it requires effort to succeed. So, no simple lessons, but it just requires effort and attention.
Fantastic. Thank you again very much, Bob, for this session's interview, and we'll be back again next time for session 4.
Okay.
And so for now, I'd like to thank you again and wish you a good evening.
Thank you. See you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.